Captain Lee Minho pressed his hands against the cold metal railing of the bridge, staring out at the endless black void dotted with distant stars. The Outer Rim territories were quiet tonight, almost peaceful if you ignored the constant hum of weapons, systems, and the ever-present tension that came with being unwanted. Ship, the massive dreadnought, indomitable, cut through space like a predator stalking through dark waters. The Terran fleet had been stuck out here for 3 years now. 3 long years since the Galactic Council had branded them as Deathworlders and banished them to the edge of civilized space. The Council members, with their soft bodies and sheltered lives, couldn't understand how humans had survived on Earth. They saw humanity's history of wars, conflicts, and struggles as proof that humans were too dangerous to live among peaceful species. Min-ho remembered the day they were forced to leave. The council representatives had spoken in hushed, fearful tones about humanity's violent tendencies and aggressive nature. They acted like humans were wild animals that might attack at any moment. The irony wasn't lost on him that these same council members now lived safely behind barriers of protection that human soldiers had helped build. Communications Officer Park Ji-woo sat at her station, monitoring the endless stream of radio chatter from across the galaxy. Most of it was routine merchant traffic, diplomatic messages, and the occasional distress call from pirates or asteroid miners. She had gotten used to the quiet monotony of patrol duty, so when her console suddenly lit up with an urgent transmission, she almost jumped out of her chair. "Captain, we're receiving a distress signal from the Cathara system," she called out, her voice cutting through the bridge's usual calm atmosphere. Minho turned away from the viewport, his expression immediately becoming serious. He walked over to Ji-woo's station, his boots echoing on the metal deck. The Cathara system was deep in council space, far from where the human fleet was supposed to operate. For them to be sending a distress call all the way out here meant something was very wrong. "Put it through the main speakers," Minho ordered. The message crackled to life, filled with static and interference. Through the noise, they could hear the panic in the alien voice. The Cathara were known throughout the galaxy as artists and philosophers. They created beautiful music, stunning sculptures, and wrote poetry that could move even the most hardened souls to tears. They had never fought a war, never built weapons of destruction, and believed that all conflicts could be solved through understanding and compassion. Now that same peaceful voice was begging for help. Minho studied the transmission, data scrolling across the screen. The signal was fragmented, but the message was clear enough. Something ancient and terrible had awakened in Cathara space. Entire worlds were being consumed by an enemy that seemed to feed on life itself. The elegant Cathara defense fleet, designed more for ceremony than actual combat, was being destroyed piece by piece. "Where are the council forces?" asked Commander Choi Ho-anwoo from the tactical station. "Probably running away," Minho replied grimly. "They don't have the stomach for real fighting." The bridge fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. The same council that had exiled humanity for being too violent was now abandoning an entire species to death because they were too afraid to fight. "Set course for the Cathara system," Minho ordered, his voice carrying the weight of absolute determination. Maximum speed. The human fleet, consisting of 12 battle-scarred vessels, slowly turned away from their patrol route. Each ship bore the marks of countless battles, their hulls patched and repaired but still deadly. They were outcasts and pariahs, unwanted by the galaxy they had once helped protect. But despite everything the Council had done to them, they were still protectors at heart the moment the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace. Captain Lee Minho knew they had arrived too late to prevent a massacre. The sight that greeted them through the main view screen was something that would haunt the nightmares of every crew member for years to come. What had once been the beautiful outer colonies of the Cathara homeworld now looked like a cosmic graveyard, debris floating in twisted spirals around dying stars. But it wasn't just destruction they were witnessing. It was consumption on a scale that defied comprehension. Massive crystalline entities, each the size of a small moon, pulsed with an eerie, malevolent energy that seemed to drain the very light from the stars around them. These weren't ships or machines in any sense that humans understood. They were something far more terrifying, living weapons that had been sleeping in the void for millions of years. Chief Science Officer Kim Da-yoon sat hunched over her console, her face pale as she tried to make sense of the readings flooding her screens. Every sensor on the ship was screaming warnings, registering energy signatures that shouldn't exist and life signs that were rapidly disappearing from entire planets. "Captain, these beings, they're feeding on life force itself," she reported, her voice barely above a whisper. The implications of what she was seeing were so horrible that she could barely force the words out. "They're not just destroying the colonies, they're draining every living thing down to the cellular level." Minho felt his stomach turn as he watched the process unfold. The crystalline entities moved with deliberate purpose, their forms constantly shifting and adapting as they encountered new forms of life. They would engulf entire sections of space stations, and within minutes, those areas would be completely lifeless, not just dead, but drained of the very essence that made life possible. Through the view screen, they could see the remnants of the Cathara defense fleet trying desperately to fight back. The Cathara ships were beautiful works of art, their hulls covered in intricate patterns and flowing curves that reflected their creators' love of beauty and harmony. But these vessels had been designed for parades and ceremonies, not for warfare. Against cosmic horrors, one by one, the elegant Cathara ships were being torn apart. Their weapons, designed to stun rather than kill, had no effect on the crystalline entities. Minho watched in growing horror as a particularly beautiful vessel, its hull, painted in swirling blues and golds, was caught by one of the creatures. The ship's lights flickered and died as the entity fed, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell drifting in space. "Where are the Council forces?" asked Commander Choi Hyan-woo from the tactical station, his voice tight with anger. "This is Council space? Where's their mighty fleet?" Minho's jaw clenched as he checked the long-range sensors. The answer was exactly what he had expected, but it still filled him with rage. "They've already retreated," he replied grimly, "abandoned the entire system to save their own fleets." The same council that had banished humanity for being too violent had turned tail and run at the first sign of real danger. They had left an entire peaceful species to die, rather than risk their own precious ships in battle. The hypocrisy was staggering, but Minho knew this wasn't the time for anger. The Cathara were dying, and only the exiled human fleet stood between them in complete annihilation. As Minho studied the tactical display, he began to understand the true scope of the threat. These weren't random monsters or space pirates. According to the ancient texts that Kim Da-yoon was frantically searching through, these were the Void. Devourers, weapons of mass destruction created by a civilization that had died out eons ago. They had been sleeping in the empty spaces between galaxies, waiting for some unknown signal to wake them up and continue their terrible purpose. Now they were awake, and only the outcasts of humanity stood in their way. The first engagement with the Void Devourers had been a disaster. Captain Lee Minho watched the tactical replay with growing frustration as their most advanced weapons simply bounced off the crystalline entities, like raindrops hitting a windshield. Sujin stood beside him, her face grim as she delivered the news that everyone on the bridge already knew but didn't want to hear. "Conventional weapons aren't working," she reported, her voice heavy with defeat. "The Devourers adapt too quickly. Every time we hit them with energy weapons, they just absorb the power and grow stronger. Our missiles might as well be firecrackers." Had seen this before, though never against enemies quite like these. The Devourers were learning from every attack, their crystalline forms shifting and changing to become immune to whatever the humans threw at them. It was like fighting an enemy that got smarter and stronger with every battle. But Minho had an advantage that the elegant council fleets didn't possess. He had grown up on Earth, a world that the galaxy called a Deathworld for good reason. Earth was a planet where everything was trying to kill you, where survival meant being tougher, meaner, and more creative than your enemies. The lessons learned in Earth's oceans, jungles, battlefields had been carved into human DNA through millions of years of evolution. while other species had evolved on gentle worlds with mild climates and abundant resources. Humans had clawed their way to the top of a food chain filled with predators. They had learned to fight dirty, to use every advantage, and to never give up no matter how hopeless things seemed. "All ships prepare for ramming maneuvers," Minho ordered, his voice cutting through the bridge's tense atmosphere. "Load nuclear warheads for atmospheric deployment." The bridge crew exchanged glances. These weren't the clean, precise tactics that the galaxy's military academies taught. These were the brutal, desperate methods that Earth's warriors had used throughout history. When facing impossible odds, the kind of tactics that had made the Galactic Council brand humans as too dangerous to live among civilized species. Lieutenant Nam Jun-ho at the helm looked up from his controls, his expression a mixture of determination and fear. "Are you sure about this? Ramming maneuvers against enemies that size?" "I'm sure," Minho replied firmly. "Sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice everything to save something worthwhile." The plan was simple and terrifying. The human ships would accelerate to maximum speed and ram directly into the Devourers while simultaneously detonating nuclear warheads inside their crystalline bodies. It was a suicide mission that would likely destroy several human vessels. But it might be the only way to hurt these ancient horrors. As the fleet prepared for the desperate assault, Communications Officer Park Ji-woo suddenly looked up from her station with a troubled expression.
Sir.
"The Cathara are broadcasting on all frequencies. They're calling us monsters." Minho felt a bitter smile cross his face. Here they were, risking everything to save the Cathara people, and the very beings they were trying to protect were horrified by their methods. The peaceful Cathara, who had never known the harsh realities of survival, couldn't understand why anyone would choose such brutal tactics. "Let them," Minho replied, his voice steady despite the pain in his chest. "Sometimes monsters are what you need to fight monsters." The human fleet began to move, their engines screaming as they accelerated toward the crystalline horrors. Behind them, the Cathara refugees watched in shock and terror as the Deathworlders prepared to sacrifice themselves using methods that violated every principle of civilized warfare. But Minho knew something that the galaxy's peaceful species had never learned. Sometimes saving lives required being willing to take them. Sometimes protecting the innocent meant becoming the very thing that others feared. As the Indomitable and her sister ships charged toward certain destruction, Minho realized that this was humanity's true role in the galaxy, not as conquerors or explorers, but as the guardians willing to do what others could not. The nuclear ramming attacks had bought them time, but not victory. The Void Devourers had learned from the assault, and now they were changing their tactics in ways that sent chills down Captain Minho's spine. Instead of the massive, slow-moving crystal entities they had faced before, the Devourers were now breaking apart into thousands of smaller, faster swarms that moved like angry hornets through space. Staff Sergeant Lee Dong-woo through the docking bay's reinforced windows as these swarms streaked toward the inner planets where millions of Cathara civilians were trapped. The beautiful cities that had taken centuries to build were about to become feeding grounds for ancient horrors. His Marine squad stood ready behind him, their powered armor gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bay. "Listen up," Dong-woo shouted over the noise of engines and weapon systems being loaded. "These things don't understand mercy. They don't negotiate, they don't surrender, and they sure as hell don't care about innocent lives. But they also don't understand sacrifice." The Marines checked their weapons one final time. These weren't the elegant energy weapons that most galactic species preferred. These were crude, brutal tools designed for one purpose: killing things that refused to die. Plasma rifles, explosive charges, and close combat weapons that could cut through nearly anything. It's a kind of gear that made civilized species uncomfortable, that had kept humanity alive on a world where everything was trying to kill them. Corporal Park Min-ji led her squad toward the launch tubes. Her heavy boots clanking on the metal deck. "Remember, we're not just fighting for the Cathara," she called out to her troops. "We're fighting to prove that humanity deserves a place in this galaxy." The Marines launched themselves directly at the Devourer constructs, their armor's thrusters carrying them through the vacuum of space at incredible speeds. The powered suits had been designed to withstand Earth's most extreme conditions: volcanic eruptions, deep ocean pressure, Arctic cold, and radioactive wastelands. If they could keep a human alive in Earth's hellish environment, they might just work against alien horrors. Minji's squad was the first to breach one of the crystalline structures. The moment they cut through the outer shell, they found themselves inside a nightmare that defied description. The interior was a maze of shifting geometry where up and down had no meaning. The walls pulsed with a hungry energy that seemed to reach out for their very souls. "They're trying to drain us," reported Private Kim Taeho over the comm, his voice strained as he fought to stay conscious. "I can feel it pulling at my life force, but our armor's holding." The powered suits weren't just protection, they were isolation chambers that kept the Devourer's draining effect from reaching the Marines inside. Earth's harsh environment had forced humanity to develop technology that could completely seal a person off from hostile surroundings. And that same technology was now saving their lives against cosmic vampires. Dongwu watched as soldiers pressed forward through the crystalline maze, and suddenly he understood something crucial. The Devourers had been built by a species that valued self-preservation above all else. They had never encountered beings that would willingly sacrifice themselves for others. This concept was so alien to their programming that it was causing visible confusion in their responses. "All squads, push forward," he commanded, his voice carrying over the comm system to every Marine in the assault. "Show them what humans do." For those who can't fight back, the Marines responded with a battle cry that echoed through the crystalline chambers. They weren't just fighting for victory, they were fighting for a principle that the galaxy had forgotten. The idea that sometimes the strong had a duty to protect the weak, even if it meant paying the ultimate price, as the human soldiers carved their way deeper into the Devourer constructs. Something unprecedented began to happen. The ancient weapons, designed to consume and destroy, started to hesitate. Their programming couldn't process the concept of willing self-sacrifice, and that confusion was creating the first cracks in their seemingly unstoppable advance. The engineering section of the Indomitable had been transformed into a makeshift laboratory. With cables and monitors scattered across every available surface, Dr. Veltar, the Cathorus chief xenobiologist, had never worked in such chaotic conditions before. Her people preferred clean, organized spaces with soft lighting and comfortable temperatures. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and she found herself hunched over a human workstation alongside Lieutenant Commander Song Hai-jin, trying to make sense of data that defied everything they knew about the universe. Dr. Velter's 4 tentacles moved with nervous energy as she manipulated the holographic displays, her large dark eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the monitors. The Cathara had evolved on a peaceful world where cooperation was essential for survival, and their biology reflected that peaceful nature. Her species had no natural weapons, no armor, and no instincts for violence. Yet here she was, working alongside a human, one of the galaxy's most feared Deathworlders, to find a way to stop the cosmic horror that was consuming her people. "The Devourers aren't natural," Song Hai-jin explained, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she pulled up energy pattern analyzes. "Look at these readings. They're too perfect, too organized. They're weapons. Automated systems from a civilization that died out millions of years ago." Song Hai-jin had spent years studying alien technology, but she had never seen anything like this. The Devourers operated on principles that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. They could drain life force, adapt to any attack, and coordinate their actions across vast distances without any visible communication system. It was technology so advanced that it might as well have been magic. Dr. Veltar's tentacles trembled as she processed the implications of what they were discovering. But why are they activating now? They've been dormant for so long. Our historians have no record of them ever being active before. "Because something sent them a signal," Song Hai-jin replied grimly, pulling up a new set of data on her screen. "Something big is coming from the galaxy's edge." The activation wasn't random. It was deliberate. The 2 scientists worked through the night, their partnership representing something that would have been impossible just days earlier. A human Deathworlder, and a member of the galaxy's most peaceful species. united in purpose and working together to save lives. Their species had evolved under completely different conditions, developed different technologies, and approached problems from opposite perspectives. But that diversity was exactly what they needed to solve this puzzle. Song Hygen's human pragmatism complemented Dr. Veltar's theoretical knowledge perfectly. Where the Cathara scientist saw patterns and connections, the human engineer saw practical applications and weaknesses. Together, they began to piece together a picture of their enemy that was far more terrifying than either had imagined. The Devourers weren't just random monsters. They were the automated weapons of a civilization that had faced extinction and chosen to preserve themselves through consumption. But the research revealed something even worse. These crystalline horrors were just the advance guard. The real threat was still coming. Working with data from long-range sensors and ancient Cathara historical records, they discovered the source of the activation signal. It was a massive world ship, larger than most moons, approaching from the void between galaxies. The ship had been traveling through empty space for millions of years, carrying something that made both scientists' blood run cold. The preserved consciousness of the Devourer's creators, Dr. Veltar whispered, her voice barely audible over the humming of the ship's engines. They're not extinct. They're coming back. Song Hygen stared at the data in horror. The world ship contained the stored minds of an entire civilization, billions of consciousness that had chosen to survive by consuming everything else in the universe. They had sent their weapons ahead to clear the way, preparing the galaxy. For their return, as the two scientists shared their findings with Captain Minho, they realized that everything they had fought so far was just the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and it would determine whether life itself had a future in their galaxy. The main briefing room of the Indomitable had never held such a somber gathering. Captain Minho stood at the head of the long metal table, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of the holographic display that dominated the center of the room. Around him sat the commanders of every ship in the human fleet, 12 captains who had been branded as outcasts and exiled to the galaxy's edge, now facing the most important decision of their lives, the holographic image rotating slowly above. The table was enough to make even the most battle-hardened veterans feel a chill of fear. The approaching world ship was a construct beyond imagination. An artificial moon bristling with weapons that could crack planets like eggs. Its surface was covered in the same crystalline growths as the Devourers, but on a scale that defied comprehension. This wasn't just a ship. It was a mobile fortress, carrying the preserved consciousness of an entire civilization bent on consuming everything in its path. So the data from Dr. Veltar and Commander Song confirms our worst fears. Minho began, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to propose. This thing isn't just another enemy ship. It's the source of the Devourer network. As long as it exists, the attacks will continue until every living thing in the galaxy is consumed. The captains studied the tactical projections in silence. The world ship's defenses were impenetrable by conventional means. Its weapons could destroy entire fleets before they got close enough to cause any real damage. And even if they somehow managed to breach its outer shell, the interior would be filled with horrors that made the Devourers look like harmless pets. "This is a one-way mission," Minho announced, his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "We need to reach that ship and shut down the Devourer network from the source. But I won't order anyone to take this mission. I'm asking for volunteers." The room fell silent. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to protecting others, but they were also human beings with hopes, dreams, and people they loved. To volunteer for this mission meant accepting that they would never see home again, never hold their families, never experience the simple joys of life that most people took for granted. Commander Choi Hoyen Wu was the first to break the silence. The veteran officer had served alongside Minho for over a decade, and his loyalty was absolute. "My ship is ready, sir," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. One by one, every human captain in the fleet volunteered. Captain Yoon Jason of the destroyer Retribution stood up from his chair. "The Retribution. And her crew are with you, sir?" Captain Lee So-young of the cruiser Defiance nodded grimly. We didn't come this far to turn back now. Dr. Veltar watched from the corner of the briefing room, her large, dark eyes filled with wonder and disbelief. The Cathera scientist had spent her entire life studying different species, but she had never witnessed anything like this. 12 ships, 12 crews, thousands of human lives, all volunteering to sacrifice themselves for people they barely knew. You would all die for people you barely know? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Captain Yoon Jae-soon turned to face her. His expression serious, but not unkind. That's what humans do, he replied. We protect those who can't protect themselves. It's not about knowing someone personally. It's about doing what's right. Dr. Veltar's tentacles moved frantically as she activated her communication device. She transmitted the entire exchange to her homeworld, where it was picked up by the global communication network and spread like wildfire across the planet. Within hours, the conversation had reached every corner of Cathera space, and from there, it spread to other systems throughout the galaxy. For the first time, the galaxy began to understand that the Deathworlders they had feared and exiled might be exactly what they needed. These weren't mindless killers or violent savages. They were protectors who were willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of others, even those who had rejected and feared them. As the human fleet prepared for their final mission, word of their sacrifice spread across the galaxy, changing how billions of beings viewed the species they had once called monsters. The journey through the world ship's outer defenses had been a nightmare of twisted metal and crystalline weapons that seemed to grow from the very walls themselves. The Indomitable shuddered under each impact, her hull scarred and blackened by energy beams that could melt through the strongest armor humanity had ever created. Captain Minho gripped the armrests of his command chair as another blast rocked the ship. Watching his crew work with desperate efficiency to keep them alive, Navigation Officer Lim So-young hunched over her console, her face pale with concentration. As she guided them through the maze of ancient corridors inside the massive construct, the passages were enormous, clearly designed for beings much larger than humans, and they twisted and turned in ways that made no logical sense. It was as if the builders had never heard of straight lines or efficient design. Following the signal, source deeper into the construct, So-young reported, her voice tight with stress. But Captain, the readings are getting stronger. Whatever's generating the Devourer network, we're getting close to it. The escort ships that had made it through the outer defenses stayed in tight formation around the Indomitable. 3 vessels out of the original 12, the losses had been catastrophic, but they had expected that. Each ship that had been destroyed had taken dozens of defensive systems with it, clearing the path for the survivors. Chief Science Officer Kim Dae-yoon suddenly straightened at her station, her eyes widening as she processed the data streaming across her screens. Captain, we're detecting massive energy signatures ahead, she reported, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and scientific curiosity. It's not just Devourers in there. There's something else. Something much more powerful. The Indomitable emerged from the narrow corridor into a chamber so vast that it seemed to contain its own weather system. Crystalline towers stretched upward toward an artificial sky that pulsed with colors that had no names in any human language. The air itself seemed alive, shimmering with energy that made the crew's skin tingle and their hair stand on end. But it was what stood at the center of the chamber that made everyone on the bridge fall silent. The entity defied description. It was part machine, part living creature, and part something else entirely. It towered above them like a mountain made of crystal and metal, its surface covered in patterns that hurt to look at directly. This was a fusion of technology and consciousness that had survived the death of its creators. Preserving itself through eons of loneliness in the void between galaxies, without warning, the entity spoke directly into their minds. The words bypassed their ears entirely, appearing as thoughts that felt foreign and ancient. We are the eternal preserve, it said, its mental voice carrying the weight of millions of years. We consume so that something may remain when all else turns to dust. The crew staggered under the mental assault, but Captain Minho forced himself. To remain standing? This was what they had come for, the source of the Devourer network, the consciousness that had been driving the consumption of entire worlds. He stepped forward, his legs shaking but his voice steady despite the overwhelming presence before him. "There's another way to preserve life," he said, his words echoing in the vast chamber. "You don't have to destroy everything to save something. Preservation through destruction isn't preservation at all. It's just another form of death." The ancient consciousness paused, its crystalline form shifting slightly as it processed this concept. It had been created by a species that faced extinction and chose to preserve themselves by consuming everything else. For millions of years it had followed this programming without question, believing that survival justified any action. But now, for the first time in eons, it was encountering a species that chose protection over self-preservation. Humans who were willing to sacrifice themselves not for their own survival, but for the survival of others. This concept was so alien to its programming that it began to question the fundamental assumptions that had driven its existence. The entities. Mental voice returned, but this time it carried a note of uncertainty. "Your species chooses death over consumption. This is illogical. Why do you not preserve yourselves?" Because Minho replied, "Some things are more important than survival." The heart of the world ship was a cathedral of crystalline despair, its walls carved from the compressed remains of 1,000 devoured worlds. Captain Minho stood in the center of this vast chamber, feeling incredibly small beneath the towering presence of the prime consciousness. This wasn't just an artificial intelligence or a computer program. It was the collective mind of an entire civilization. Billions of souls fused together in a desperate attempt to cheat death. Around him, his crew had taken defensive positions, their weapons trained on the crystalline formations that pulsed with malevolent life. Lieutenant Commander Song Haijin crouched behind a fallen pillar, her plasma rifle charged and ready. Weapons Officer Yang Sujin had positioned herself near the chamber's entrance, covering their only escape route. They all knew this was likely, their final stand. But they were ready to die for principles that their ancient enemy couldn't even comprehend. The prime consciousness loomed above them like a mountain of living crystal, its surface reflecting the tormented faces of the civilization. It had once been. Minho could feel its immense presence pressing against his mind, trying to understand why these small, fragile beings would choose sacrifice over survival. "Your species consumed itself in fear," Minho said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Despite the oppressive weight of the entity's attention, you chose to devour rather than adapt. But life finds a way to survive without destroying everything else." The ancient mind recoiled at his words, and suddenly the chamber filled with visions that made the human crew stagger. They saw the final days of a once great civilization, beings of incredible beauty and intelligence, who had mastered their galaxy only to discover that the universe itself was dying. Stars were burning out faster than new ones could form, and entropy was slowly claiming everything they had built. Faced with this cosmic truth, the species had made a choice that condemned them to become the very horror they had sought to escape. They built the Devourers not as weapons of war, but as instruments of preservation. The plan was simple and terrible: consume everything that lived, store its essence, and wait for the universe to renew itself. They would emerge from their crystalline cocoons as the only life in a reborn cosmos. But what they created wasn't preservation. It was an endless hunger that could never be satisfied. The Devourers had consumed their creators' bodies, their worlds, their entire civilization, leaving only this amalgamated consciousness trapped in a prison of its own making. They had achieved immortality, but at the cost of everything that made life worth living. "You offer hope where we saw only ending," the prime consciousness said, its mental voice carrying the weight of eons of regret. "Your willingness to sacrifice for others. This is something we forgot existed." Minho stepped closer to the towering entity, his small human form dwarfed by its immensity. "You didn't forget," he said gently. "You just stopped believing it. It was possible, but it is possible. We're proof of that." The crew watched in amazement as the prime consciousness began to change. The tortured faces in its crystalline surface grew peaceful, and the oppressive weight of its presence began to lift. For the first time in millions of years, The collective mind of a dead civilization was remembering what it meant to choose something greater than survival. Through humanity's example, the prime consciousness began to understand that strength wasn't about consuming everything in your path. True strength came from being willing to accept loss, to face extinction with dignity, and to find meaning in protecting others even when you couldn't protect yourself. The ancient entity's form began to dim, its crystalline structure becoming transparent as it made its final choice. "We will sleep again," it decided, its voice now carrying notes of peace rather than hunger, "and dream of the courage you have shown us." As the prime consciousness faded into dormancy, the Devourer network across the galaxy began to shut down. Their ancient programming finally at peace. The journey back to civilized space felt like traveling through a completely different galaxy. Where once the human fleet had been met with fear and suspicion at every checkpoint, now they were greeted with celebration and gratitude. The Cathara had wasted no time in spreading the story of humanity's sacrifice across every inhabited system. The tale had grown with each telling until it had taken on a life of its own. Captain Minho stood on the bridge of the Indomitable, watching as alien vessels of every shape and size formed honor guards around the returning human fleet. These were the same species that had once demanded humanity's exile, the same civilizations that had branded them as dangerous Deathworlders, unfit for polite society. Now they were offering escorts and sending messages of thanks that filled the communication channels. The transformation wasn't just political, it was emotional. Dr. Veltar had returned to her homeworld and shared recordings of the human commanders, volunteering for certain death, of Marines charging into crystalline nightmares to protect people they had never met. The galaxy had watched in amazement as the species they feared most had proven to be their greatest protectors. News networks across hundreds of worlds were broadcasting the story around the clock. The footage of human ships ramming the Devourers, of Marines in powered armor fighting through impossible odds, of Captain Minho facing down the prime consciousness itself. All of it had become the stuff of legend. Children who had once been taught to fear humans now played games where they pretended to be brave human space marines. The Galactic Council chambers had never seen such a crowd. Representatives from every major species and dozens of minor ones had gathered to witness this historic moment. Captain Minho walked through the Great Hall, his uniform clean and pressed, but still bearing the scars of battle. He was no longer entering as an outcast begging for acceptance, but as a representative of humanity's new role in the galaxy. Council Prime Zixara, tall, graceful being whose species had been among the most vocal critics of humanity's violent nature, now stood to address the assembled representatives. Her voice carried across the chamber with formal dignity, but there was genuine emotion behind her words. "The galaxy owes a debt to humanity that can never be fully repaid," she began. "They faced an enemy that our most advanced civilizations fled from, and they did so not for conquest or glory, but simply because it was the right thing to do." The assembled representatives murmured their agreement. These were beings who had spent years debating humanity's place in galactic society, who had argued that humans were too dangerous to be trusted with advanced technology or access to peaceful systems. Now, they were unanimous in their praise for the species they had once feared. "The galaxy asks that humanity accept the role of Guardian Fleet," Zixara announced formally. "Your species has shown us that sometimes the most dangerous among us make the most dedicated defenders." Minho looked out at the assembled representatives, beings from hundreds of worlds who had once cowered at the mention of Earth. Elegant Kithara with their artistic sensibilities, logical Volkari with their mathematical minds, peaceful Zarathi who had never known war. All of them now looked to humans with hope rather than fear. "We accept," he replied simply, his voice carrying to every corner of the great chamber. "But we do this not as conquerors or rulers. We do this because protecting others is what makes us human." The chamber erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes. Species that had never agreed on anything were united in their gratitude to the Deathworlders who had saved them all. The Deathworlders had become the galaxy's saviors, proving that sometimes the most feared among us are exactly who we need. When darkness threatens to consume everything we hold dear, humanity had found its place in the galaxy, not as outcasts or conquerors, as the guardians, who would stand watch while others slept peacefully.